During a fiery CNN primetime debate, lifestyle mogul and actress Gwyneth Paltrow launched what appeared to be a meticulously prepared attack against faith-driven actor Jonathan Roumie. The beloved star of The Chosen, known for his grounded presence and spiritual depth, responded with a quiet strength and clarity that left Paltrow speechless and captivated millions across the country. This unanticipated exchange rippled through social media within minutes, becoming one of the most talked about moments in television all year. In CNN's New York studio, the tension was palpable. Camera operators tracked every subtle shift between the two high-profile guests. Producers whispered through headsets, their hands twitching over commercial break buttons, as millions of Americans leaned in to watch what had been advertised as a bold conversation about faith, fame, and cultural influence in modern America. Behind the scenes, CNN's team had carefully orchestrated the segment, promoting it as a no-holds-barred dialogue between influential public figures. Extra security had even been deployed in anticipation of potential controversy, fueled by online chatter suggesting the conversation might turn confrontational. Gwyneth Paltrow adjusted her microphone with a confident, almost condescending smile. She seemed assured this would be a polished takedown of a man she and her team had painted as dangerously out of touch. In her lap sat a sleek binder filled with Roumie's interviews, quotes about Jesus, and what she described as regressive views on gender, identity, and culture. Opposite her, Jonathan Roumie sat serene and still. His demeanor carried the quiet dignity of someone used to navigating storms without raising his voice. His eyes moved slowly across the studio, not with anxiety, but discernment. A production assistant, glancing at the teleprompter, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Is she really going to come at him like this?" The reply came just as quietly, "Roumie doesn't flinch. He'll handle it his way." Anderson Cooper opened the segment with a brief overview on how celebrity voices shape political and cultural discourse. He then turned to Paltrow. She leaned in, voice sharp behind a veil of politeness. "Jonathan," she began, "your work, especially your role in The Chosen, has drawn widespread attention for what many critics call glorified religious nostalgia, outdated gender roles, and oversimplified moral messaging. At the same time, your public comments on faith and tradition have raised concerns about how aligned you are with modern values. Do you feel any responsibility for shaping potentially exclusionary narratives?" There was a pause. The tone had shifted immediately. Cooper looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing this had begun more aggressively than anticipated. Roumie, however, remained unfazed. Paltrow pressed forward, citing moments from his show and interviews, accusing him of reinforcing patriarchal structures, spiritual absolutism, and failing to keep up with society's evolving ethical landscape. She referenced past comments Roumie made about faith, his defense of traditional family values, and what she called lack of inclusivity in the way The Chosen presented morality. "Your body of work," she concluded, "might be meaningful to some, but to many of us, it reflects a worldview we've outgrown, one that reduces human struggle to black and white answers and elevates a male figure as the lone arbiter of truth." Some audience members nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the rawness of the attack. Roumie didn't blink. He simply listened. Anderson Cooper turned back toward him, gently moderating. "That's certainly a strong critique, Gwyneth. Jonathan, would you like to respond?" What followed wasn't a counterattack. It was revelation. For nearly 8 minutes, Paltrow had lectured him with what she believed was academic force and moral superiority. But Roumie's response began not with defense, but reflection. He leaned forward slightly, hands calmly folded, a soft half-smile forming at the edge of his mouth. "May I respond now?" he asked, voice low and composed, that distinct warmth in his tone unmistakable. "Please do," Cooper said, now clearly intrigued. Silence fell. Even the studio lights seemed to hold still. Jonathan Roumie turned his eyes to Paltrow, not with judgment, but quiet sincerity. "You know," he began, "in my years as an actor, and more importantly as a man of faith, I've learned that what people think they see is often not what's truly there." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of experience, humility, and spiritual conviction. "Ms. Paltrow, you've raised serious concerns tonight," he continued, "and I respect that. But I have to wonder, have you truly watched what we've created? Or are you reacting to the assumptions that others have drawn around it?" From beside his chair, Roumie retrieved a small leather folder. Few had noticed it until that moment. "I came prepared," he said gently, "because too often we confuse perception with truth." Paltrow shifted slightly in her chair, a barely visible twitch of discomfort, betraying what seemed to be an unexpected crack in her composure. "I've seen the major episodes of The Chosen, Jonathan," she replied curtly. "My points stand on their merits." "Then let's examine those merits," Roumie said, his tone still gentle, never rising yet carrying the unmistakable authority of someone deeply at peace with what he stands for. "You mentioned that my work promotes a black and white view of morality and an idealized version of religious life that alienates rather than includes. Have you seen episode 7 of season 2? "Of course," Paltrow responded quickly. "That's the one critics call your turning point episode." "Then you know it's a chapter entirely focused on the disciples' brokenness, their doubts, their ego, their fear, and the pain they carry. The whole point of that episode," Roumie said, opening the folder in front of him, "is to show that faith is not simplistic. It's agonizing, it's costly. It requires us to surrender control, not assert it." He held up a page. "These are direct excerpts from theologians and scholars who've studied The Chosen as a rare portrayal of spiritual life that doesn't simplify, but instead wrestles with human frailty and divine silence." Roumie looked straight at her, not with malice, but with clarity. That episode resonated with millions of people not because it offered answers, but because it showed the pain of not having them, he said quietly. The studio was silent. "You spoke of outdated gender roles," Roumie continued, flipping to another page. "Have you seen the arcs of Mary Magdalene, Tamar, or Eden in our series? Women who confront trauma, carry theological insight, and minister alongside the men, not behind them." Paltrow nodded faintly now. Her earlier certainty was fading, the facts reshaping her stance in real time. "And your comments about me idealizing a male savior figure," Roumie said, "are worth examining, because I don't play Jesus to validate myself. I portray him to remind people that love doesn't dominate, it lays itself down. And every time the character speaks, it's not about power, it's about humility." He placed another document on the table, citing academic reviews and psychological assessments of the series' impact on viewers struggling with anxiety, addiction, and isolation. Each example came with scenes, themes, and dialogue, disarming Paltrow's accusations one by one. The firmness in her expression gave way to visible uncertainty. "As for moral oversimplification," Roumie said, "we created storylines for Matthew, a character with autism spectrum traits, struggling with social rejection, and Simon the Zealot, a radical wrestling with violence and vengeance. These aren't caricatures, they're reflections of the real spiritual battlefield inside human beings." He paused, then added with grace, "Miss Paltrow, you've said my work promotes exclusion, but I've played a Middle Eastern Jesus, spoken openly about mental health, addiction, grief, and redemption, not as sermons, but as shared human experience." The studio remained frozen in silence. Paltrow's face, earlier bright with conviction, now bore the flush of internal conflict. She tried to pivot. "But what about your public positions?" she asked, her tone losing edge. "Some of your interviews have concerned people. Statements about tradition, family, your views on modern culture." Roumie nodded without hesitation. "Yes, let's talk about that," he said calmly, reaching for a different set of notes. "You mentioned my support for traditional marriage and my opposition to cancel culture. Fair critiques. I won't pretend I've always said things perfectly." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the room. Roumie smiled, humble and composed. "But did you also know," he continued, "that I've spoken out against Christian nationalism, that I've defended immigrants' rights, participated in interfaith dialogue, and supported trauma-informed ministry programs for abuse survivors?" He laid down a document listing public speeches and interviews showing a wide range of socially conscious stances, positions that defied the narrow conservative faith actor box he'd been placed in. "I'm not a political operative. I'm not a culture warrior," Roumie said. "I'm an actor who loves people. That's it. And I speak what I believe, even when it's uncomfortable." He leaned forward slightly, voice still measured. "The problem with modern dialogue, Miss Paltrow, is that we rush to assign labels, progressive or regressive, enlightened or outdated, as if people can be summed up in a hashtag. But human beings are far more complicated than that. And ironically," he added gently, "the show you've critiqued is about challenging those very labels." For a full 12 seconds, Gwyneth Paltrow, normally fluent, formidable, sat in stunned silence. The dynamic in the studio had completely shifted. Everyone could feel it. These examples certainly demonstrate more nuance than I acknowledged, she managed, her voice missing its earlier confidence. Roumie nodded with kindness. There's something else worth mentioning, he continued, this time more personal. You implied I don't understand the modern world, but I've walked through addiction, rejection, doubt, loneliness. I've seen how desperate people are for meaning and how cynical our culture can be when someone tries to offer it. He paused, breathing softly. That doesn't make my voice more important than yours, but perhaps it gives me a different vantage point, one that reminds me how dangerous it is to judge a soul or a story without really looking. The studio remained completely still. Anderson Cooper's expression reflected something close to reverence. The studio remained suspended in stunned silence. Even Anderson Cooper, a veteran journalist rarely shaken, looked visibly moved by Roumie's composed, heartfelt response. What I've consistently tried to do in my work, Roumie said quietly, is remind people that human beings are never one-dimensional. We carry light and shadow in equal measure, great beauty and terrible brokenness, often in the same soul. He paused, his voice softened further. If there's one thread that runs through everything I've tried to portray, it's that redemption is real, and that the most dangerous thing we can do is judge someone based on a sliver of who they are. He looked not at Paltrow, but into the lens, as if addressing the public directly. Maybe that's a lesson our political and cultural conversations could benefit from too. Within 30 minutes of the show's end, clips of the exchange had gone viral. On TikTok, Instagram, X, and YouTube, millions watched in rapt attention as Roumie dismantled assumptions, not with outrage, but with grace, depth, and undeniable moral clarity. In a film studies class at UCLA, students gathered around a laptop watching the clip in silence. When it ended, their professor simply said, "That's what great storytelling is. It may look simple on the surface, but it's wrestling with the hardest truths we carry." In a Florida retirement community, a group of residents erupted in applause. "I've watched hundreds of interviews," one 87-year-old woman remarked, "but that felt sacred." A 30-something independent director sent the segment to his team with a simple message. This is how you handle criticism, not by counterattacking. By knowing your work so intimately, you let it speak for itself. The hashtags #Roumie Grace and #Nuance Matters trended within the hour. Across ideological lines, film critics and political commentators began chiming in. Even some who had previously dismissed Roumie as a faith actor with limited scope now praised his ability to articulate moral complexity without becoming combative. One prominent critic posted, "You don't have to share Roumie's beliefs to recognize the depth in what he said and what he's portrayed." Tonight, we were reminded why reductive readings of art are a disservice to the truth. CNN's competitors broke into their programming with special reports analyzing the interview. Cultural analysts, film professors, theologians, and ethicists were invited to weigh in. One scholar summed it up. What we witnessed wasn't just a performer defending himself, it was a living example of why art matters, and how it often says what politics can't. In households across the country, families who rarely agreed on anything found themselves pausing and reflecting. A liberal arts professor in Chicago texted her conservative brother, "I think we both misjudged him." That segment was beautiful. Backstage, when asked to stay for a follow-up interview, Roumie politely declined. "I said what needed to be said," he told the producer with a quiet smile. "The rest, let the work speak for itself." Back in the studio, Paltrow sat alone, flipping through her notes. For the first time in her public career, she wasn't strategizing a rebuttal or polishing a media spin. She was rethinking. Later that night, Gwyneth Paltrow posted to social media, "Tonight's exchange with Jonathan Roumie gave me a lot to reflect on. While we may differ in worldview, I see now that his work deserves more thoughtful engagement than I initially offered. I'll be rewatching with fresh eyes." The post went viral, praised across the political spectrum for its humility. 3 days later, appearing on another panel, Paltrow did something even more surprising. "I spent the weekend revisiting several episodes of The Chosen and interviews with Jonathan," she admitted. "There's a quiet, enduring complexity to his work that I hadn't fully appreciated. It reminded me how often our political filters block us from recognizing truth in unexpected places." Film schools nationwide began assigning the Roumie-Paltrow exchange as required viewing. Professors used it to teach students the danger of reducing art to political caricature and the power of grace under fire. A month later, a respected film journal published a sweeping analysis of Roumie's performances in spiritual artistry, describing his portrayals as profound moral meditations wrapped in simplicity, offering insight rather than imposing dogma. Jonathan, meanwhile, returned to editing his latest project, a story about memory, reconciliation, and undeserved mercy. A colleague asked him what it felt like to go viral. With a characteristic shrug, Roumie replied, "Sometimes the world needs reminding that grace still has power." And across college campuses, dinner tables, and creative studios, something had shifted. People began asking a new question. Am I judging the work, or my assumptions about the person behind it? It wasn't a revolution, but it was a real change. A deeper willingness to sit with complexity, to listen longer, and to respond with more than reflex. 2 weeks after the live interview, Roumie and Paltrow met again, this time quietly, at a charity gala in New York. They were seen speaking privately for nearly 20 minutes. No cameras, no microphones, only a soft, sincere conversation between two people, one changed by humility, the other rooted in grace. And for those who had watched, it was proof. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can offer is not a victory, but understanding. Witnesses later described seeing a calm, respectful 20-minute conversation between Jonathan Roumie and Gwyneth Paltrow during a private moment at a charity gala in New York City. There were no cameras, no crowd, just two people exchanging thoughts in hushed tones. Paltrow listened closely, visibly engaged as Roumie spoke with his characteristic sincerity. Though neither revealed the specifics of their discussion, Paltrow later shared in an interview, "It was one of the most enlightening conversations I've ever had about art, faith, and how much we miss when we reduce each other to labels." The ripple effects of the original CNN exchange didn't fade. They expanded. Several major universities organized symposiums on faith, politics, and narrative complexity, using Roumie's body of work and that unforgettable interview as a case study. Professors encouraged students to examine how storytelling and storytellers are too often flattened by ideological expectations. CNN, surprised by the surge in ratings from thoughtful, nuance-driven content, announced a new weekly series, Beyond the Frame, Art Without Labels. The first episode featured artists and thinkers from across ideological divides, discussing how political assumptions often rob creative works of their depth. Most significantly, something shifted in the cultural atmosphere. Viewers began approaching books, films, and performances with more curiosity and less presumption. Reviews of The Chosen and Roumie's other projects began to focus on the actual emotional and thematic content, rather than the creator's perceived worldview. 6 months later, Jonathan Roumie released his latest film, a deeply introspective drama about memory, grace, and generational forgiveness. Critics across the spectrum praised it for its emotional complexity and spiritual honesty. During a rare interview to promote the film, a journalist asked him about the viral CNN moment. Roumie smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes confrontation is needed, not to win, but to reveal truth. But the real question is, do we see each other more clearly afterward?" At the film's premiere, Gwyneth Paltrow sat quietly in the audience, having accepted Roumie's personal invitation. The next day, she published a thoughtful review. While she acknowledged moments where her views diverged, she praised the film's moral ambition and artistic restraint. Her nuanced, respectful tone earned admiration from readers across ideological lines. Later that